All right. So this week, we are in the final part, the fifth part of a series called More Than Words. More Than Words. If you haven't been here before, we take our teachings, like this part of the service, we usually clump them together in what we call a series under some common theme or idea or question. And that's what we're doing this week. If you haven't been with us, I'll catch you up a little bit. And for the rest of you, it'll be review. But you can help me out here, okay? The question that we're asking everybody together, if you know it, the question is, what's forming you? Come on, can we do a little better? What's forming you? Great question. The question is, really, what's shaping you? What's forming you? What are the things in your life that are affecting the way that you see, the way that you respond, the way that you react, the way that you take in information, right? All of us, to some extent or another, are being molded and formed, whether we realize it or not. And we're being formed in positive ways and in negative ways, right? So, like our country, the U.S., one thing that's become a norm in our culture, our country, is the idea of generosity, right? We all, for the most part, agree that it's good to be helpful and generous to people who are less fortunate. That's a value in our country. But believe it or not, that's not a value in a lot of other parts of the world. But you and I, for the most part, see it as a value because our culture has shaped us in that way. It's taught us to think that way. But at the same time, there's a lot of research that's emerging that's showing us that a lot of the pressure that people feel today, specifically like pressure that parents feel to succeed, to do everything right, to be perfect, like a lot of that is a result of things like social media and the connected world that we live in. In a way, it's forming us. The pressure that you feel to succeed in the workplace, to have it all together, to look like everything's A-okay all the time, like you're killing it. That's the product of the way our culture is forming us. And if we're not aware of it, we may be being formed into the kind of people that we don't want to be. I realized a few years ago, this is like 2017, I realized I was doing a lot of sitting all day long, right? And so I was becoming really stiff and my movement was like limited. I realized like I couldn't even bend down and touch my toes, like not even close. And so I decided to try to start stretching. And I didn't do much, but I just kind of made a habit of trying to touch my toes, right? I know this is ridiculous, but pretty soon after that, I was able to, watch, I'll show you, all the way. And thank you very much. Really though, I know this sounds silly, but in a way, it was eye-opening. It was like, it's amazing that there are little things we can do that actually can change us. Little things like that. And in the same way, there are little things we can do, little things we can incorporate into our lives that can change the way we respond to things like hardship and disappointment and frustration and pain. It change the way we react to the difficult situations, the difficult people in our lives, the difficult scenarios that we're in. There are things we can do. Now, Jesus showed up in a culture where people were being formed. They were being formed by external factors, by the Roman Empire that was governing them and oppressing them in a lot of ways, by the lack that they experienced, by the hypocritical religious culture that they were part of. It was forming them. And so Jesus gave them a tool that was supposed to teach them to pray, but also change the way they see everything, like alter their world view. And we have evidence that shows us that the church in its earliest form, they incorporated this tool, this prayer into their lives on a regular basis, and it really did form them and shape them. The tool, some of you know this, is what we call the Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, or this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And I don't know about you, but like when I hear that, I'm not like, oh yeah, this is the thing that's changing the way I see everything. Right? For me, and for a lot of people I've spoken to, this tool, this life-altering, perspective-shaping tool has been lost to meaningless repetition. We've learned how to say it, we've learned the words, we've learned when to say it, but because these words have lost meaning to us, they've lost the ability to shape us. And so we've been going through over the past few weeks exactly what's going on here with the hope that we'll relearn what's going on here and that it will be able to shape us. And so we started on week 1 with the first 2 lines, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Now maybe for you that brings up feelings of distance and formality. I didn't call my dad father, and so I think father like distance. But maybe for you it's even more complicated than that. Maybe the person in your life who was supposed to be father wasn't there. Or maybe he didn't do such a great job of making you feel seen and cared for. And so when you hear father, you think, I don't need another one of those. And so it's clear, it's important that we understand what Jesus meant when he said, start out by praying, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. He's showing us, he's trying to communicate to us that God is not this distant almighty being who's just there to give rules and tell people what to do and not do. He is close and he's good and he cares. He's in a category all on his own. Like no one is invested in your well-being as much as God is. No one cares about you like he does. And so it's important that we have this picture when we begin this prayer because we said your audience determines your approach. Who you're speaking to determines how you approach that prayer, what you say in that prayer, what comes out in that prayer. It's important that you have an accurate picture when you picture God, which is why Jesus starts out this way. And then he goes on with this next part. It sounds like a lot of religious jargon, but he says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, what he's saying is if you're good, if you're in a category all on your own, if there really is no one like you, then I want your will to be done. Like I want what you want if you really are that invested in me. I want my life to look like you're the king, like you're calling the shots. And when we do that, Jesus would say we're starting to bring the realities of heaven to earth. Not like fluffy angels and butterflies and like clouds, but what we were made to be, how we were made to live. Like to push out the brokenness. And so that's a pretty big picture, right? There's this all-powerful good God who wants you to call him Father, and he wants you to live in a way that brings the reality of heaven to earth. And then it's like, well, how? And that's where we get to the next part of the prayer. He says, give us this day our daily bread and forgive us our trespasses. We forgive those who trespass against us. The idea is that God is a giver. He wants to help. He wants you to look to him to help you do this, to bring these realities and values of heaven here to earth. He's close, he's generous, he cares, and he wants to give you bread, not bread for life, not bread for the week, not even bread for the day, but bread for the moment. He says, give us this day our daily bread. That's redundant. It's bread for the moment, inviting him into your every moment and seeking help. Last week, we talked about how he wants to help in our relationships. And this involves understanding that God has forgiven us in spite of our brokenness. And so with that, we can forgive other people in spite of their brokenness. God wants to help in our circumstances. And then we get to this last part. This last part here is where we are today. He says, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. I read that and I'm like, okay. Like, but what's going on there, right? Like, is God, if I don't pray that, is God going to lead me into temptation? Is he going to put me in situations where I'm tempted? Like, what actually is happening there? So there's about 20 years ago, there's a professor from Stanford University who came out with this concept or coined this concept called the growth mindset. I think I mentioned it here before. Her name is Carol Dweck. And the idea behind the growth mindset is that those who think they can develop and learn and grow and improve are the ones who develop and learn and grow and improve. And she would say that along with the growth mindset, there's a fixed mindset. In other words, there are some people that believe that they are the way they are, and people don't change. And they have what they have, and they're going to be who they're going to be, and they're not going to change. You call that a fixed mindset. Now, the research that has emerged behind this has been very interesting, right? The idea is that you can take two groups of people, one group who has a growth mindset, and one group who has a fixed mindset. You can have them engage, theoretically, in the same activity, and one group will improve, and the other one won't. And it comes down to the mindset. Or we could say, the mindset makes the difference. The great thing about this last part of the prayer is even if you're like not sure about God, you're not sure you're like into church, not even sure why you're here today, or maybe you're just trying to figure it out. Like this is one of those concepts that like works whether you're on board with the whole church thing or not. It's something that Jesus was saying back then and that people who study psychology are saying right now. The mindset makes the difference. Along with this whole idea of the growth mindset, there's another mindset that's emerged more recently. They call it the stress is enhancing mindset. That's in quotes. It needs a new name. The stress is enhancing mindset. And the idea is that people who believe that stress enhances their performance actually experience the performance enhancing effects of stress. And people who believe that stress is a detriment to their performance experience the detrimental effects of stress on their performance. So they took two groups of people, and they've repeated this experiment, but they took two groups of people and they primed them both, right? So one group, they showed them a video of how stress is so good for your performance. And then another group, they showed a video of all the detrimental effects of stress. Both videos were completely true, right? But one side only saw the good, the other side only saw the bad. And then they put them in a stressful situation and had them like have to perform. And the group that was primed to believe that stress would enhance their performance completely outperformed the group that was primed to believe that stress was going to hinder their performance. In other words, the mindset makes the difference. Believe it or not, like there's a lot going on in this last part of the prayer. A lot. Let's put it up here. But one of the ideas behind this, especially as Jesus' brother explains this concept, is that the mindset makes the difference. And I know that you were thinking that as soon as you saw like lead us not into temptation and deliver us from evil. But really, the mindset can make the difference. So if we like just pick this apart for a second here. This word for temptation, one of our translations actually that we've sent out on the app translates this word test. In other words, we could say, don't lead us to be tested. In the original language, that word that's translated temptation, it is literally the word test. And so the prayer is, don't lead us to be tested, but deliver us from evil. Now, when you think deliver, it's help or rescue, like come to our aid, right? And evil, don't think like right and wrong. Think evil like toxic, poisonous, things that erode at the goodness of the great things in life. And these two lines, this was written, the prayer, believe it or not, was written to be memorized. And so these two lines, they're packaged together. The idea here, and we may miss this reading in English, but the idea is don't lead us into it, but get us out of it. Deliver us from it. Help us through it. Don't lead us to be tested, but deliver us. So then for me, I don't know, I'm pretty like skeptical. I got a like critical mindset. I'm like, test? Like, well, who's testing, right? If there's a test, then there's a tester, right? Like, are we like God's little lab rats? He just wants to see what we're going to do. When Allie and I were preparing to like launch community church, like back when it was just like an idea, we partnered with an organization called Orchard Group. And before they gave us the okay, Orchard Group, before they partnered with us, they sent us away to this assessment center. We were there for a few days, but it felt like years. And they just put us through tests. It was horrible, horrible. And everywhere we went, there were people with clipboards like this. Everywhere. We were in North Carolina. They sent these people, really, they sent them to the hotels. There were people in the hotel lobbies watching our interactions. It's like, are you serious? Like, you really want to see? I'm going to pour my waffle batter into the iron? You know, it's like, I felt like I was being watched constantly, and they're just taking notes. And I was not thrilled about the situation. Fortunately, we made it out all right. But this is the picture. When I think test, this is the picture. Like, oh, so God's up there just like, all right, let's see what he's going to do. You know, how are you going to respond in this situation? And for me, this doesn't live peacefully with like our Father in heaven who knows us like no one else does and who's deeply invested in our well-being. And so the question is, what do you think when you think test? Here's a little video of my daughter a few years ago. Check it out.
All right. Don't touch these until I say you can. Okay? Don't eat them and don't touch them. Okay?
No.
Don't touch that either, okay? You touch it? Did you touch it?
No.
You can eat it.
Thank you.
So I acknowledge that that's a pretty messed up thing to do. But that's what I picture when I picture test, right? Or really, what I picture is the idea of enticing, right? Like, let me put something in front of you and don't touch it. Like, there's all that joy and satisfaction right in front of you, but don't touch it. And this is the picture that I picture when I picture God, right? We're in a test. Like, he's like, okay, don't go that way. You're gonna have fun, you're gonna enjoy it, but don't do that. Or maybe you think evaluate, right? This is a more typical understanding of test. Like, okay, let's see what you're gonna do, right? Like here, you're in a situation, you could choose this way or that way, let's see. And so you evaluate for the sake of finding something out. But whenever you come to a concept in a verse from the Bible, especially from the Bible, right? And it doesn't make sense because it's written in a totally different language. Something that's really helpful for you and I to do is to look at a specific word, specifically the key words in the passages, and ask, am I understanding this term the way it's meant to be understood, right? And that's the problem with test. If you think entice, if you think evaluate, then you're picturing this God who's behind the whole situation just looking at you like a lab rat with a clipboard in his hand. But what if a more neutral way of understanding this word is with the term exercise? Or to think to put something to the test. To put it into practice. So imagine you got a boyfriend and girlfriend, right? And they're in high school and they're in love. And they're gonna be together forever. And they make all these promises to each other, and that's great, right? But then they go away to school and they separate. What you can say is, like, while they're together, there's this loyalty that's developing. There's all this loyalty, right? But it's not put to the test until they're separated from each other, right? And it's not like someone's like, let's see if they make it. It's like, no, there's this thing that was abstract that doesn't become concrete until it's actually got to be put into practice, until something is actually, like there's some weight on it, right? Or taxi cab drivers in London have some of the hardest jobs ever because the streets in London are not like nice grids like they are in New York City. They're all like spaghetti. And so you just have to memorize so much. It's this big thing. It's become like pretty well known. You can say that their knowledge of it is put to the test. It's exercised when they're put out on the road, right? It's not necessarily that they're having a road test, but it's being tested. It's being exercised. This thing that was abstract until it was put into practice is now being exercised, right? And in the same way, we can understand testing in that way. James was the brother of Jesus, right? And he, more than anyone else in the New Testament, writes almost like a commentary on the teachings of Jesus. And so if you read the book of James, it's pretty short and it's fascinating. He mentions a lot of what Jesus says. And some people think in the very beginning of his letter, he's actually explaining this concept. And here's what he says. Ready? He says, consider it pure joy, right? See the good, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Now, this word for trials here in the original language, it's the same exact word that Jesus uses when he says, don't lead us to be tested. James is saying, look how you see it, right? See it, like see the good in it whenever you face these tests of many kinds. Why? Why? He says, because you know that the testing, not of your loyalty, not of your knowledge of the roads in London, but the testing of your faith, the testing of what you believe to be true about God, the testing of that produces perseverance. Now, this is one of those things, like if you know that verse, you jump to the end of it before I finish reading it. Oh yeah, the testing of your faith produces perseverance. But this is counterintuitive. Like when you and I think tests, we think tests like to measure growth. What he's saying is testing produces growth. It doesn't measure it. You know, it's fascinating. Coincidentally, I was listening to a podcast about 3 weeks ago. It was the Andrew Huberman podcast. I mentioned him before. It's getting to the point where I have to stop mentioning his name because I mentioned him so much. But he was talking about learning, like how, like the most effective ways to learn and to offset forgetting. And he said there's all this research that shows that the best way you can learn something is to test yourself on it. Like to take the knowledge and put yourself in a situation where you have to exercise it. So you gain some information and then either you have to like write it out or you perform something that causes you to exercise that knowledge. And what it does is it produces something. So they did an experiment. They had these people read a biography 4 times. And then they had someone read the biography, or they had another group of people read the biography 1 time, but then they tested them on it. At the end, they tested both groups, and what they found is that the group that read it 4 times was way more confident, but actually knew way less than the group that read it once and was tested on it. Because they became so aware of what they didn't know, and it solidified the things that they already did know. And so what's amazing is here's James 2,000 years ago. He's like, the test itself is going to strengthen your faith in a way that will allow it to persevere, endure. Like, in other words, when you're in a situation and you're thinking like, okay, I know what I want to do, and often, sadly, it's destructive. And then I know what God wants me to do. He's saying, when you, like, that's a test. And when you choose to do what God wants you to do, it's not God up there with like a clipboard, like, let's see what he's going to do. No, it's putting that belief to the test. And when you do it and you're like, whoa, okay, actually this was a good thing. Like this ended up for my good, for flourishing. There was something that felt like that's what I was made to do. It strengthens that. You've exercised it. So if instead of thinking a clipboard, right? Like it's It's why I feel like exercise is not the perfect word, but it's a helpful word. Why? Because when I try to lift this weight, what I'm doing is taking like some theoretical strength that's in this arm, and I'm exercising it. I'm putting it into practice. And what's amazing about this is that the more that I do it, the stronger that it gets. And the more you find yourself in a situation where you're like, I could go this way or that way, I could choose to trust God or choose not to trust him, the more you choose to trust him, the stronger your faith gets. Or I would even suggest when you choose not to, if you have the wisdom to stop and turn around and think, how'd that go? You'll see, like the test itself can strengthen your faith. You'll see, okay, maybe I should have gone the other way. Maybe there was a better way to go here. I think, though we may not have said it like this, I think what James is trying to get us to do, like if we're talking about mindset, when it comes to which way do I go, how do I handle this in difficult situations, when it comes to how you see it, I think what James is getting at here is like instead of thinking so much like how can I get out of this? What if we began to more intentionally think what can I get out of this? What if it produces something? Like life is hard. But there's good to be gained from the difficulty that you're going through. Now again, here, if you're like me, I'm like, okay, all right, I get that. You know, the more you exercise something, the stronger theoretically it gets. Like it's tested, you're drawing on the strength that's there or not. Yeah, sure. But still, like I gotta resolve this clipboard picture of God. Like, because that doesn't live in perfect harmony with a God who is a father who just genuinely cares for his children. Like there seems to be a contradiction between line 1 and the last line, the first line and the last one. And James, now there's a lot of differing opinions on the whole idea of God and testing and difficulty and all that stuff, and it's complicated. There's a lot of different dynamics to it. But James says something that is crystal clear. He says, like, when you're going through one of these testing situations, he says, let no one say God is testing me. He says, because God doesn't work that way. God doesn't test, nor can he be tested by evil. And then he goes on to explain, like, we live in the reality of a broken world. And within me, there are broken desires. For some reason, I choose things that are bad for me. And what James would say is it's those desires, the existence of those desires within the brokenness that we live with that create the possibility for this test to even exist. And then he says, just in case you didn't understand that, like just to be crystal clear, James says, don't be deceived. Like, don't be mistaken. Don't believe something that you might be tempted to believe, my dear brothers and sisters. He says, every good and perfect gift is from God, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He gets a little poetic there, but the idea is like, you know, your shadow, if you ever looked at it in the morning and looked at it halfway through the day and looked at it at the end of the day, it started here, it got short, and then it got longer again, it shifted, right? Like God isn't like that. God is this ongoing, like ever-present source of goodness. The good in your life is from God. And there's brokenness in this world that we deal with, and those constantly create situations where we're like, my faith, my trust in the goodness of God is being put to the test. Do I believe him or do I believe me? Do I believe do I want what's best for me or what feels good right now? It's constantly being put to the test. And that's because of the reality of the brokenness within us. But the promise is that it will produce something. And so my question for you is, where are you being tested? Maybe it's in a little way. Maybe it's a big way. Maybe it's a season of testing where you know, like, there's a way you can go. The way that God would lead you. But it's going to require you to have hope in his goodness, because it might feel counterintuitive. It might not be the easy thing. It might not be the thing that feels good right now. It might be the difficult, the long, the hard thing to do. And you've got a choice. How do you see it? Do you see it as God holding back, like he's just trying to limit you, he's trying to make your life difficult? Do you see it as him just trying to evaluate you or entice you? Do you see it as meaningless suffering, like life just stinks and I just got to get through it? Or do you see it as something that can produce something? The mindset makes the difference. The mindset makes the difference. And so that's the prayer. That's the Lord's Prayer. Let's put it back up here, right? The Our Father, however it was introduced to you. This is the thing that I think Jesus believes can form us, can shape us. And while this all sounds good, really think practically. What if you actually believed this? Maybe you're in the middle of the road, you're not totally sure. Maybe you're just dipping your toe in the water. Or maybe you've been in the church thing the whole time, you've learned what to say, but really hasn't sunk in. What if it actually did? If it formed you? Or let's put it this way. What if in the moments when you felt like, I'm in this alone, instead, you chose to believe that God is good, that he's close, and that there's no one like him? What if in the moments when you felt like, I need to get control, instead, you chose to believe, I want him because he's good, I want him at the wheel? What if in those moments where you're like, I've got to fight for my good because there's nobody else who's invested in my good. I've got to help myself. I've got to fight my own battles. What if in those moments instead you chose to believe that God is a giver and that he wants to help and that he's invested in your good? What if in those moments when you want to hold on and keep a grudge, what if instead you decided to let go and give grace? What if, during life's most difficult seasons, when you feel like it's just hard, it's not fair, and my suffering is meaningless, what if instead you chose to believe that there is good to be gained from the hardship that you're going through? I believe, for me personally, I believe that if I believe those things, I believe it would make me a better dad. I think I'd be a better husband. I think I'd be a better friend. I think I'd have more peace. I think I'd experience more joy. I think life would feel more abundant, be light and free. And I think that this is why Jesus wants us to pray like this. Not just because he wants this to form us, but because he wants that for us.